In Bahia, in the year 1549, a Jesuit who had just arrived from Portugal walks to a rock by the riverbank. And there, engraved on the stone, he observes what he describes as 4 human footprints with well-defined toes. And the indigenous people tell him an ancient story passed down from generation to generation that a long time ago, a white man with a beard and long robes down to his feet had come from the sea, and he taught them how to plant manioc, forbade cannibalism, calmed the storms, and healed the sick. And when the natives tried to shoot arrows at him, the river opened up and he crossed without getting wet, then left heading east toward India. The name of this character would be Sumé, or, as that priest would soon conclude with absolute certainty, St. Thomas, the apostle of Christ, the one who doubted and put his finger in the wound. But after all, did one of the 12 apostles really arrive in Brazil 15 centuries before the Jesuits? Why did Father Manuel de Nóbrega become obsessed with this idea in his very first year in Brazil? How did this story spread along the coast of Brazil, reaching as far as Peru and Paraguay? And why deep down did the Portuguese want this to be true so badly? In today's video, we're going to dive into the fascinating stories of St. Thomas, or Sumé, and understand how the obsession with the apostles' legacy became a political, ideological, and geographical tool that stitched Brazil to India, Christendom woven into a single fabric. To understand how the apostle became rooted in Brazil's imagination, we need to go back long before the discovery to the Christian tradition itself surrounding St. Thomas. According to the oldest tradition recorded by Eusebius of Caesarea, St. Thomas left Jerusalem after Pentecost and went east, evangelizing the Middle East. And later, according to other writings, he arrived in India. There, it is said that he founded Christian communities and died pierced by a spear. And the most interesting thing about this is that with the expansion towards India, the Portuguese were able to look into these stories. When the Portuguese finally arrived in India with Vasco da Gama, in 1498 they actually found Eastern Christian communities who claimed to be heirs of the preaching of St. Thomas. These are the so-called St. Thomas Christians, connected to the Nestorian branch. In other words, for the Portuguese mentality of the 16th century, St. Thomas was not a distant figure. He was the living proof that the good news had, in some way, already reached the ends of the earth. And if it had reached India, it could also have reached the new lands on the other side of the world. The main person responsible for strongly spreading the presence of St. Thomas in Brazil was Father Manuel da Nóbrega, the first Jesuit to lead the mission in Portuguese America. He arrived in Brazil with the expedition of Tomé de Sousa, who founded Salvador, in 1549, and reports that he taught the indigenous people about God, the Trinity, the Virgin Mary, and the apostles. But when he spoke about Thomas, the indigenous people would start jumping as if they identified with a saint. In one of these letters, he says that the indigenous people attribute even the roots they use to make bread, probably cassava, to St. Thomas, because before, according to them, they didn't have any bread. And he states that nearby, there are some footprints carved into the rock that everyone says belong to him. In another letter to his former teacher in Coimbra, Nóbrega records that the indigenous people have knowledge of Noah's flood, although in a confused way. The crucial link appears in the earlier third letter. The Jesuit writes that the indigenous people say that St. Thomas, whom they call Sumé, passed through there. He says that he personally went to see the footprints by the river, and that he saw with his own eyes 4 clearly marked footprints with the toes visible. And he reproduces the natives' account that the saint was fleeing from the indigenous people who wanted to shoot him with arrows, because he wanted to prohibit polygamy in some of the few tribes on the coast that were still polygamous among the indigenous people. And so, the river opened up, he crossed to the other side without getting wet, and from there, he went to India. Manuel de Nóbrega became obsessed with the subject. Out of the 5 letters he wrote in his first year in Brazil, 3 mentioned St. Thomas. And the account of this Sumé was not something limited to Bahia. Various different peoples along the coast of Brazil, from the Tupis to the Miminos, from Ceará to São Paulo, always had the same reaction when the Jesuits spoke of Thomas, and they always reported this Sumé, a story that circulated among different peoples from different regions of Brazil. And what's interesting about all this is that the reports about this Thomas are even older than the arrival of the Jesuits. In the New German Gazette from 1514, which belonged to the Fugger banking family, there are reports about Brazil and about some experiences of Portuguese pilots in the New World. And there, already in 1514, it is reported that the natives also wanted to show the Portuguese the footprints from the interior of the country. They also showed a cross that stands further inland. And when they talk about São Tomé, they say he is a lesser god because there is another god who is greater. It's quite amazing that they have memories of São Tomé because it is known that São Tomé is actually beyond Malacca in the Gulf of Ceylon. And here comes a fascinating point brought up by one of the greatest historians of Brazil, Sergio Buarque de Holanda, in his classic work, Vision of Paradise. Buarque treats the accounts of Manuel de Nóbrega not as anthropological reports of a priest with the indigenous people, but as a form of a very peculiar legend. Tomé is a healer because his footprints are close to medicinal water springs used to cure diseases. Tomé is also a botanist because he taught the indigenous people how to plant and settle down, and finally he is a moralist. But he notices something curious. The conquest of America was accompanied by a flood of myths, almost all of them of Spanish origin. The Castilians, since Columbus's first letters, filled the New World with the idea of an earthly paradise, the fountain of youth, the Amazons and their treasures, and the white king of El Dorado. The Portuguese, in turn, were much more modest in their myth-making. And, according to Holanda, they produced practically the only great myth of the conquest that was genuinely Luso-Brazilian, the myth of St. Thomas or Sumé. The researcher Pedro Dalla Bernardina Bracco reports in his article that, unlike the Spanish myths that looked forward toward gold in the paradise to be found, this Portuguese myth looked back. It didn't speak of treasure to be discovered, but of a truth that had already been revealed and was later forgotten. It was not a myth of greed, but rather of memory. That's because there was a major theological problem facing the Europeans. If all of humanity came from Adam and Eve and then from Noah, where did those peoples of the New World whom no one knew existed come from? How could they be fit into sacred history? The solution, as psychologist Manuela Carneiro da Cunha points out, was continuity. The inhabitants of the New World necessarily had to descend from Noah's sons. And here, Nóbrega makes a revealing association. The nudity of the Indians would be precisely a sign of this descent from Ham, who, according to the Bible, exposed his father naked. And as Hamites, descendants of Noah, would they even have retained a vague memory of the flood, albeit a corrupted one? The Jesuit says that they know about Noah's flood, although it doesn't match the true story, because they say that everyone died except for an old woman who escaped in a tree. And there is also news of St. Thomas and his companion, and they show certain marks on a rock which they say are theirs, as well as other signs in São Vicente, which is at the end of that coast. And he says that they gave them the foods they still eat today, which are roots and herbs, and with that they live well. And so the myth of St. Thomas concluded the reasoning. If the apostle had passed through there, then those peoples were not simply Gentiles who had never heard of God? Were they children of Adam who one day received the good news and then forgot it? Didn't they need to be converted from scratch? Did they just need to be reminded? And the accounts of St. Thomas weren't just meant to settle the question of the native souls. He also solved another problem, they say. That's because in the 16th century, no one had a clear idea of the size or the exact mapping of the world. And there was a common suspicion circulating among the Portuguese. What if Brazil and India were actually part of the same landmass, or were very close to each other? In the New German Gazette of 1514, an experienced pilot who had already been to India claimed that from that cape in Brazil, there were more than 600 leagues to Malacca. Just a year earlier, in 1513, the Spanish had discovered the South Sea, the Pacific Ocean. But the discovery still did not encompass the entire ocean, and it wasn't even known by everyone in the world. And, besides that, only 5 years later, the expedition of Ferdinand Magellan would set out, which would circumnavigate the world for the first time. In other words, if St. Thomas had crossed from Brazil to India by land without getting wet, as the Indians of Nobrega said, then the two worlds could be connected. And this is where the story literally gets legs. There was, cutting across the South American continent, an ancient network of indigenous trails. The most famous of them started from the southern coast of Brazil, with entrances from São Vicente and Cananea, crossed the interior, and reached Paraguay. And from there, it reached all the way to Peru. The natives called it Pibiru. The Portuguese then renamed the trail to the Path of St. Thomas, because it was said to be the route he took towards India. And as the researcher Pedro Bracco points out, the figure of the indigenous hero merged with that of the Christian hero. Throughout Spanish and Portuguese America, phonetic variations of the same name could be heard. Sumé, Zomé, Pai Zumé, Pai Tomé, from Peru to Brazil. It was almost the same word. And did that make it much easier to merge the two cultures into one? When the Jesuits arrived with the story of a holy man, white and bearded, who came from the ocean and promised salvation, weren't they filling a void? Were they actually skillfully tapping into an expectation that already existed? And then, it's worth remembering something we've already explored here on the channel in the video about Sumé, the Brazilian indigenous man who became a nobleman in France. The Tupi and Guarani peoples already held a strong messianic tradition centered on the belief in the land without evil, which was beyond the ocean. And this fit perfectly with the Portuguese Christian cosmology. Was the story of St. Thomas widely known in Portuguese Brazil? Even Protestant pirates like Antony Neve, who ravaged the coast of Brazil, reported the strange stones that the locals believed were miracles of the saint. And the obsession with St. Thomas wasn't limited to Brazil. It traveled with the Jesuits to the other side of the world. St. Francis Xavier, the great apostle of the East sent by King John III, also went searching for traces of St. Thomas, but this time in China. In a letter from 1546, Xavier says that he asked several Portuguese when they went to Chinese ports to ask about local customs so they could tell whether the people there were Christians. And they report that many said that St. Thomas had gone to China and made many Christians, and that the Greek church, before the arrival of the Portuguese, used to send bishops to baptize the Christians that the apostle and his disciples had supposedly left there. In other words, whether it was in the backlands of Brazil or in the ports of China, was the method the same. To look for the invisible thread of St. Thomas, which, it was believed, stitched all of humanity together through a forgotten faith? Was the apostle the universal key that opened any door in the Portuguese world? And so, was it a true Lusitanian obsession, from the beaches of Brazil to the farthest reaches of the Far East? So, going back to the question from the beginning, did St. Thomas really come to Brazil? That might not even be the most interesting question, because the truly extraordinary fact isn't whether Thomas came. It's actually the linguistic and behavioral coincidence that connected both worlds. For Sergio Buarque de Holanda, the accounts of St. Thomas were the Jesuit solution that wove Brazil, India, and China into a single fabric, as places visited by the apostle, all as children of the same Adam. It was an account that connected 3 continents, that turned an indigenous trail into the path of a saint, serving as a theological bridge for the empire that needed to find meaning and order in the utter chaos of discovery. Thus, in the end, the account of St. Thomas does not tell us much about the apostles' route. It actually reveals the mind of those searching for him. A fascinating kind of thinking that is the perfect synthesis of the 16th century soul. And you, have you heard the stories about St. Thomas or Sumé? What surprised you the most? So go ahead and leave your comment right now to support our work, and take the opportunity to become a member of the channel right now. This way, you'll have access to exclusive content so you can not only support our work, but also dive deeper and learn even more about the fascinating Iberian history.